October 23rd, 1944. The Philippine Sea lay still as glass, beneath the sky the color of burnished steel. From my position on the forward deck of the heavy cruiser Atago, I could see nothing but water stretching to every horizon, the surface broken only by the wakes of our formation cutting white scars through the blue. 23 warships steaming in perfect alignment, their hulls gray as ghosts, their battle flags streaming in the wind that smelled of salt and oil and something else, something I could not name but recognized as the scent that precedes death. My name is Takeshi Yamamoto. I am 24 years old. I have served in the Imperial Japanese Navy for 6 years. In 4 hours, I will watch my ship torn apart by American submarines. In 3 days, I will witness the destruction of the most powerful battleship force ever assembled. In 4 days, I will be floating in burning oil, watching my navy die around me. But on this morning, as the sun rises behind us and paints the clouds the color of cherry blossoms, I am simply a fire control officer performing my duties, unaware that I am sailing toward the end of everything we fought for. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would become the largest naval engagement in human history. Over 200,000 men would fight across 100,000 square miles of ocean. When it ended, the Imperial Japanese Navy would cease to exist as a fighting force. But history remembers only the statistics, the ships sunk and men drowned, the tactical maneuvers and strategic failures. No one speaks of what it felt like to stand on a burning deck while the sea around you turned to fire. No one remembers the sound a battleship makes when it dies, the screaming of steel and the silence of men who have stopped screaming. I remember everything. We had sailed from Linga Roads near Singapore 5 days earlier, part of Vice Admiral Kurita's center force, the main striking arm of Operation Shogo, the last desperate gamble of a dying empire. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity and mad in its ambition. 3 separate Japanese fleets would converge on Leyte Gulf, where American forces were landing on the Philippine beaches. Admiral Ozawa's northern force would lure the American fast carriers north with our few remaining flat tops, sacrificial lambs meant to draw away enemy air power. Meanwhile, Kurita's center force, 23 warships, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, would punch through the center. Admiral Nishimura's southern force would attack from the south. Together, we would destroy the American invasion fleet and turn the tide of the war. We knew it was desperate. We knew the Americans controlled the air, controlled the seas, controlled everything that mattered in modern naval warfare. But we were samurai of the sea. We had been taught since childhood that spirit could overcome material superiority, that the righteous cause would prevail through purity of will. We believed because we had to believe, because the alternative was accepting that everything we had sacrificed meant nothing. The Atago was magnificent. 13,000 tons of steel armor and firepower, she could make 35 knots and carried 10 8-inch guns that could reach out 20 miles to strike enemy ships. Admiral Kurita himself commanded from her bridge, making her the flagship of the entire center force. Standing on her deck, feeling the throb of her engines through the steel plates beneath my feet, I felt invincible. The morning routine proceeded normally. I checked the fire control computers, ancient mechanisms that translated bearing and distance into firing solutions, mechanical brains that clicked and whirred as they calculated trajectories. The mathematics of destruction, precise and cold. My station was deep in the ship's hull, surrounded by electrical cables and hydraulic lines, a maze of technology that had once seemed modern but now felt obsolete compared to the American radar systems we knew existed but could barely comprehend. At 05:32 hours, the alarm bells began ringing.
The sound was different from the regular drill signals. Urgent, panicked. I grabbed my helmet and ran toward my battle station, feet clanging on the steel ladders as I descended into the bowels of the ship. Around me, men were moving with practiced efficiency, each to his assigned position, the choreography of combat we had rehearsed 1,000 times. But there was something in their faces I had not seen before. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The understanding that what was coming was not another drill or minor engagement, but something final. The submarine attack came without warning. American submarines had been shadowing our formation since we entered the Palawan Passage, hunting us through waters we thought we knew, using technologies that made them invisible hunters. The USS Darter fired 6 torpedoes at the Atogo from less than 1,000 yards. I felt the first impact before I heard it. The ship lurched sideways like a wounded animal. The lights went out instantly, plunging the fire control station into absolute darkness. Then the emergency lighting kicked in, red bulbs that painted everything the color of blood. The second torpedo struck 15 seconds later. The explosion transmitted through the hull as a physical force that knocked men off their feet. The third torpedo hit near the engine room, and I knew immediately that we were dead. Water roared into the compartments below. I could hear it through the steel plating, a rushing, hissing sound, like a waterfall, like the end of the world compressed into audio form. The ship began listing immediately, tilting to port at an angle that grew steeper with each passing second. Men were shouting, but the words were meaningless against the sounds of destruction. Steel screamed as bulkheads buckled. Pipes burst, flooding the passages with scalding steam. The smell of fuel oil became overpowering, thick and choking, coating the back of my throat. I climbed toward the upper decks, following emergency procedures drilled into me through years of training. Move up. Move aft. Get to the weather decks before the compartments flood. Simple rules that did not account for the chaos of a dying ship. The passageways were canted at impossible angles. Men scrambled past me in both directions, some following procedure, others panicked and lost. I saw Ensign Watanabe trying to close a watertight door against the pressure of incoming water, his uniform already soaked, his face set in grim determination. He looked at me as I climbed past, nodded once, and continued his work. I never saw him again. When I reached the main deck, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The Otago was dying fast, listing 30 degrees to port and sinking by the bow. Oil-covered water swirled around the forward gun turrets. Men were jumping overboard, dark shapes against the morning light, falling to a sea that would offer no salvation. The Takao and Maya, our sister ships, were also under attack, torpedoes tearing into their hulls, explosive waterspouts erupting alongside their armor belts. Admiral Kurita stood on the bridge wing gripping the railing, refusing to abandon ship even as the deck tilted beneath his feet. I could see him, from my position near the aft superstructure, a small figure against the sky, watching his flagship die. Finally, his staff officers physically forced him into the water. The admiral of the entire center force, the man who would lead us to victory or destruction, reduced to swimming in oil-slicked seas while his command dissolved around him. I jumped at 6:15 hours. The water was warm, almost pleasant, but thick with fuel oil that coated everything it touched. The taste was immediate and revolting. Petroleum in my mouth, my nose, my eyes. I swam away from the ship as fast as I could, fighting the suction that every dying vessel creates, the pull that wants to drag men down into the depths. 19 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the Otago rolled over and sank. I was 200 yards away, treading water, watching. She went bow first, stern rising out of the water to reveal her massive propellers still turning in the air. The sound was indescribable, metal tearing, air rushing from ruptured compartments, the voices of men still trapped inside. Then she was gone, leaving only bubbles and debris, and oil slicks spreading across the surface like dark wounds.
Over 300 men died with her. 300 sailors who had trained together, eaten together, fought together, now entombed in steel at the bottom of the Palawan Passage. I floated in the wreckage, surrounded by survivors clinging to debris, and felt the first cold understanding of what was coming. This was the third day of our operation. We had not yet reached the battle zone, had not yet engaged the American fleet, and we had already lost our flagship and 2 heavy cruisers. What hope did we have? Destroyers pulled us from the water over the next hour. I was hauled aboard the Kishinami, soaked and shivering despite the tropical heat, my uniform ruined, my body coated in oil that would take days to fully remove. They gave us water and rice balls and new clothes. They asked if we could continue. We said yes, because what else could we say? The mission continued, the fleet continued. We would transfer to other ships and fight on, because stopping was not an option our culture had prepared us for. Admiral Kurita transferred his flag to the battleship Yamato, the mightiest warship ever built. 72,000 tons of steel, 9 18-inch guns that could hurl projectiles weighing as much as small cars over 25 miles. The Yamato was invincible, we told ourselves. American bombs and torpedoes would shatter against her armor like waves against cliffs. With Yamato leading us, we could still win. I was assigned to the light cruiser Yahagi as a replacement officer. She was smaller than Otago, faster, more modern, with better radar and fire control systems. I reported aboard that afternoon, still reeking of fuel oil, still tasting petroleum, still seeing the Otago's propellers turning in the air as she died. The executive officer looked at my face and did not ask questions. He simply showed me to my new station and told me to prepare for combat operations. That night, we continued sailing toward our objective. The mood aboard the fleet was grim but determined. We had lost 3 cruisers and 700 men, but the core of our force remained intact. The battleships Yamato and Musashi, the battleship Nagato, heavy cruisers Haguro and Chokai, light cruisers and destroyers, still a formidable force. We could still accomplish the mission. We had to believe that. October 24th dawned clear and bright. The Sibuyan Sea stretched before us, relatively narrow waters between islands, a constricted passage that offered no room for maneuver. American reconnaissance aircraft found us at dawn. We watched them circling at high altitude, silver specks against the blue, radioing our position and composition. We knew what was coming. The American carriers would launch their strike aircraft, wave after wave, until we were destroyed or forced to retreat. The first attack came at 10:30. 30 aircraft, Helldivers and Avengers, diving from 12,000 feet. The sky filled with anti-aircraft fire, black puffs of exploding shells creating a wall of steel that the Americans flew through as if it did not exist. I was at my fire control station, calling out bearings and elevations, watching through the rangefinder as enemy aircraft positioned for their runs. The Musashi took the first hit. A bomb struck her foredeck, the explosion visible as a flash of orange fire against gray steel. Then another. Then torpedoes began running, white wakes streaking through the blue water, converging on the super battleship from multiple directions. She twisted and turned, her massive bulk responding slowly to the helm, but she was too large, too unmaneuverable. Waterspouts erupted alongside her hull as torpedoes struck home. The attacks continued all day, wave after wave. We counted 5 major strikes, over 250 aircraft, more planes than some nations possessed in their entire air forces. They came from the carriers Enterprise, Franklin, Intrepid, Cabot, and Essex, names that meant nothing to us then, but would be carved into history as the instruments of our destruction. They had endless aircraft, endless pilots, endless ordnance. We had only what we carried and the determination to continue.
The Musashi fought magnificently. She took torpedo after torpedo, bomb after bomb, absorbing punishment that would have sunk any other ship a dozen times over. Her 18-inch guns fired at the attackers, massive shells equipped with timed fuses that exploded in mid-air, creating shotgun blasts of shrapnel that swatted aircraft from the sky. But for every plane she destroyed, 10 more came. It was mathematics. Simple, brutal mathematics. I watched through my rangefinder as Musashi gradually died. She listed to port, then her crew counter-flooded compartments on the starboard side to correct the list. She listed to starboard, and they flooded port compartments. She settled lower in the water with each attack, her main deck eventually awash, waves breaking over her forward turrets. Still she fought, still her guns fired, still her crew fought damage control parties working in flooded compartments, her engineers keeping her engines running, her gunners loading and firing even as their stations flooded. At 19:30 hours, as the sun set behind the islands, the Musashi capsized and sank. We were 30 miles away by then, continuing our advance, but we saw the pillar of smoke marking her grave. Over 1,000 men went down with her, including her captain, Admiral Inoguchi, who lashed himself to the binnacle and refused evacuation. The mightiest battleship ever built, unsinkable in theory,
destroyed by massed air attacks that our Navy had no effective defense against. Admiral Kurita made the decision that would define the battle and his reputation. At 1500 hours, under continuous air attack, watching the Musashi sink and seeing damage accumulate across his force, he ordered a temporary withdrawal. We reversed course, sailing away from our objective, seeking sea room to regroup and tend our wounds. The Americans thought we were retreating. Their reconnaissance aircraft reported us heading west, away from Leyte Gulf. The American commanders relaxed, believing the center force had been turned back. But at 1530 hours, after the American aircraft had returned to their carriers for the night, Kurita reversed course again. We turned back toward our objective, sailing through the darkness toward the San Bernardino Strait, the passage through the Philippines that would bring us to our target. It was a brilliant deception. The Americans had no night reconnaissance. Their radar could not penetrate the islands. They believed we were defeated when in fact we were simply delayed. That night, I stood watch aboard the Yahagi, staring into darkness broken only by the luminous wakes of our ships. Around me, men prepared for surface combat, the type of warfare we had trained for, ship against ship, gun against gun, the kind of battle where Japanese night fighting skills and superior torpedoes might compensate for American material advantages. We would arrive off Samar at dawn. We would fall upon the American invasion fleet before their carriers could launch aircraft. We would vindicate everything we had sacrificed. No one slept. How could we? We had watched the Musashi sink. We knew what American air power could do. But we also knew that the surface battle, the night fight in the dark, was where Japanese sailors excelled. Give us gun range, give us torpedo range, and we would show the Americans what the Imperial Japanese Navy could accomplish. At 400 hours, on October 25th, we passed through the San Bernardino Strait. The navigation was treacherous, narrow channels between dark islands, currents and reefs that could rip out a ship's bottom. We made it through, guided by searchlights and careful seamanship, emerging into the Philippine Sea east of Samar Island. Dawn was still 2 hours away. We were behind schedule, but undetected. The element of surprise remained intact. At 6:45 hours, as the sun rose, our lookouts spotted masts on the horizon. American ships, the invasion fleet we had come to destroy. Admiral Kurita ordered the attack signal hoisted. Every ship acknowledged. We increased to flank speed, black smoke pouring from our stacks as the boilers strained to maximum output. Battle flags flew from every mast. This was the moment we had sailed 2,000 miles to reach. This was where the tide would turn.
Then reality struck us like a torpedo to the heart. The ships we had spotted were not the slow, vulnerable transport and landing craft of an invasion fleet. They were warships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers. We had stumbled into Taffy 3, a task unit of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Spragg. They were not the main American fleet, just a small support group providing air cover for the landings. But they had carriers, they had aircraft, and within minutes they would have us in range. The Americans were as surprised as we were. Their carriers had been conducting routine air operations, launching aircraft for ground support missions when we appeared on their radar at 20 miles.
They immediately began emergency launch procedures, throwing every aircraft into the air, regardless of armament or fuel state. They turned east, running away at their maximum speed of 17 knots, making smoke to hide their positions, screaming for help on every radio frequency. We were faster. The Yamato could make 27 knots, the cruisers could make 35. We closed rapidly, our main batteries opening fire at 0659 hours. The Yamato's 18-inch guns spoke, each shot a physical shockwave that rippled through the air. I was at the fire control station aboard Yahagi, calculating ranges and bearings, calling out corrections, watching through optics as our shells fell among the American carriers. What followed was the most surreal 3 hours of my life. We were winning. We had caught a vastly inferior American force by surprise. Our battleships and cruisers were tearing into their thin-skinned escort carriers, ships that were basically merchant hulls with flight decks welded on top. We should have annihilated them in 30 minutes. Instead, we faced American destroyers. The destroyer Johnston charged us alone, a single 2,100-ton vessel with 5th-inch guns attacking battleships that displaced 40 times her tonnage. She came straight at the Yamato, guns firing, smoke pouring from generators, making herself a target to draw fire from the carriers. It was suicide. It was magnificent. It was everything we had been taught about samurai spirit, except the Americans were not supposed to have that spirit. They were supposed to be soft, materialistic, unwilling to die for honor. The Johnston fired torpedoes at 10,000 yards, spread aimed at the Yamato. The super battleship turned hard to cone the tracks, and the entire formation had to maneuver, breaking our attack formation, costing us precious time. Then the destroyer Howl joined the attack. Then the Samuel B. Roberts, a tiny destroyer escort that should not have been in a surface action at all. These small ships charged into the teeth of the most powerful battleship force ever assembled, trading their lives for minutes for the carriers. American aircraft swarmed us like angry wasps. They were armed with whatever had been loaded. Depth charges meant for submarines, light bombs for ground support, some with nothing but their machine guns. They made attack runs anyway, forcing us to maneuver, forcing our anti-aircraft guns to fire, creating chaos in our formation. A torpedo bomber put a fish into the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow. Another bomber damaged the Suzuya. The battleship Congo took a bomb hit that did little damage but started fires. I was calling out targets mechanically, my voice steady, while my mind reeled. This was wrong. The Americans were supposed to run. They were supposed to die quickly and efficiently. Instead, they were fighting like cornered wolves, trading everything for time, refusing to accept the logical outcome of overwhelming force meeting inadequate defense. The destroyer Johnston finally died at 0945 hours. She had taken dozens of hits from cruiser and battleship guns. Her superstructure was demolished, her hull was shredded. She was dead in the water and burning. We passed close aboard, close enough to see men still manning the guns, still firing even as their ship sank beneath them. I saw an officer on her bridge, facing us, saluting as her ship rolled over. Later I learned he was Commander Ernest Evans, her captain, who went down with his command. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, we would have called him a hero and built a shrine to his memory. I did not know then that the Americans would give him their highest decoration, the Medal of Honor. I only knew that watching that destroyer die felt wrong, like killing something that refused to acknowledge it could be killed.
At 9:15 a.m., Admiral Kurita ordered the fleet to cease pursuit and regroup. We were scattered across 30 miles of ocean, individual ships chasing individual targets, our formation dissolved, our collective firepower dispersed. He ordered us to reform and prepare for a coordinated attack. It was the correct tactical decision. It was also the decision that lost us the battle. By the time we reformed at 1,000 hours, the moment had passed. The American carriers had escaped into rain squalls. More American aircraft were arriving from other carrier groups, hundreds of planes vectoring toward our position. We had sunk one escort carrier, the Gambier Bay, and destroyed 3 destroyers. In exchange, we had suffered damage to multiple ships, consumed enormous amounts of fuel maneuvering and fighting, and lost the element of surprise. Admiral Kurita made his final decision. We would withdraw. The transport fleet we had come to destroy was still in Leyte Gulf, still vulnerable, still theoretically within reach. But reaching them would require sailing through the strait in daylight, under continuous air attack, with no air cover of our own. We had accomplished nothing. We had come within miles of the greatest naval victory in Japanese history and withdrawn without achieving our objective. The retreat was agony. American aircraft hunted us all day, following us back through the San Bernardino Strait, attacking anything that showed damage or fell behind. The heavy cruiser Chikuma, damaged earlier, could not keep up. Aircraft swarmed her. At 16:55 a.m., she capsized and sank. The Chokai, another heavy cruiser, was hit by bombs and had to be scuttled. The Zuzuya, damaged by near misses and internal explosions, was abandoned and sank. We limped back toward Brunei, our force reduced, our ammunition depleted. Our mission failed. I stood on the Yahagi's deck as we cleared the strait, watching the islands recede, and felt nothing. Not relief at survival, not anger at failure. Nothing. The emotional capacity to process what we had experienced had burned out like electrical wiring, overloaded beyond its capacity. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf was not over. While we were failing off Samar, Admiral Nishimura's South Force had attempted its own attack through Surigao Strait. They sailed into a perfect ambush. American battleships, many of them resurrected from Pearl Harbor, crossed the T, positioning their full broadsides against the Japanese column. It was a textbook maneuver from a bygone era, the last time battleships would fight battleships in the classical sense. Nishimura's force was annihilated. The battleships Fuso and Yamashiro were sunk. Every destroyer and cruiser was destroyed or damaged. Over 4,000 men died in that narrow strait, their ships pounded to scrap by American battleships firing with radar fire control in the darkness. Nishiura himself went down with the Yamashiro, standing on her bridge as she capsized. His entire force ceased to exist in less than 3 hours. And Admiral Ozawa's northern force, the carrier group sent to lure away American carriers, they succeeded perfectly. Admiral Halsey took the bait, racing north with his fast carriers in battleships to engage what he thought was the main Japanese threat. Ozawa's carriers were nearly empty, with barely enough aircraft to provide token air cover. They were decoys, sacrificial offerings meant to die so that Kurita's center force could accomplish its mission. The Americans found them off Cape Engano on October 25th. The slaughter was methodical. Wave after wave of American aircraft struck the defenseless Japanese carriers. The Zuikaku, last survivor of the carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, took multiple torpedoes and bombs, finally capsizing at 14:14 hours. The light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho were all sunk.
Over 3,000 men died in the cold waters off northern Luzon. Ozawa succeeded in his mission. He drew Halsey away. He created the opportunity for Kurita to destroy the invasion fleet. But when Kurita withdrew, when the center force turned back without accomplishing its objective, Ozawa's sacrifice became meaningless. The carriers and their crews died for nothing.
I learned these details later. Pieces of information assembled from survivors and combat reports. On October 26th, as the Yahagi sailed south toward Brunei, I knew only that we had failed, that something terrible had happened, that the Imperial Japanese Navy had committed everything to one last desperate gamble and lost. The statistics would be compiled by historians. The Battle of Leyte Gulf involved 370 ships and over 200,000 men. The Japanese Navy lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Over 300,000 tons of warships. Approximately 12,500 men killed. The Americans lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort, about 37,000 tons and 3,000 men. But numbers do not capture what was lost. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force. The ships that survived had no fuel to operate. The pilots were dead or too inexperienced to be effective. The industrial capacity to replace losses did not exist. After Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy could stage only one more major operation, the suicide mission of the Yamato to Okinawa, where she would be sunk by aircraft before reaching her target. On October 28th, we limped into Brunei Bay. The Yahagi's hull was intact, but her crew was shattered. Men moved like ghosts, performing their duties mechanically, not speaking unless necessary. I went ashore and found a quiet place beneath palm trees that swayed in the tropical breeze, sat down on sand that was warm and white, and tried to understand what had happened. We had sailed with the most powerful surface action force assembled since Jutland. We had training, experience, tradition, and spirit. We had the Yamato, the Musashi, the concentrated firepower of an empire. We had been willing to die, had accepted death as probable, had embraced the samurai code that valued honor above survival. None of it mattered. The Americans had a radar that could find us in darkness. They had aircraft that could attack in weather that grounded our planes. They had destroyers willing to charge battleships. They had industrial capacity that replaced losses faster than we could inflict them. They had pilots trained so thoroughly that even novices could execute complex attacks. They had a dozen escort carriers where we would have had 1. They had redundancy, backup systems, reserve forces, replacement personnel. They had broken the code of modern warfare that we refused to accept. Spirit could not overcome material. Tradition could not defeat technology. Honor could not stop high explosive. We had spent decades preparing to fight the last war, the war of battleships and gunnery duels and samurai codes. They had built the next war, the war of carriers and aircraft and industrial production. I thought of the Otago sinking beneath me, her propellers still turning. I thought of the Musashi absorbing torpedo after torpedo, fighting until she had nothing left. I thought of the destroyers charging the Yamato, suicidal courage that should have been Japanese but was American.
I thought of all the men floating in oil-slicked water, drowning in the darkness, dying for a strategy that was obsolete before it began. The bitterness was overwhelming. We had been told our spirit was superior. We had been told that one Japanese sailor equaled 10 Americans. We had been told that righteous cause and pure will would carry us to victory. All lies. Or perhaps not lies, but truths from a world that no longer existed. Beliefs that could not survive contact with the reality of modern industrial warfare. In early November, I was transferred back to Japan aboard a transport ship that sailed at night and hid in harbors during the day to avoid American submarines and aircraft. Tokyo was being bombed regularly now. B-29s flying from bases in the Marianas that we could no longer threaten. The factories that built our ships were rubble. The shipyards that repaired them were destroyed. The fuel to operate them no longer existed in sufficient quantities. I reported to the Naval Staff Office and was assigned to shore duty, training new recruits who would never see combat because there were no ships left to crew. The boys who arrived were 16 and 17 years old, conscripts with no choice, sent to learn a profession that no longer existed. I taught them fire control procedures for ships that had been sunk. I taught them navigation techniques for operations that would never occur. I taught them the traditions and honor codes of a navy that had died in the waters off Samar. In April 1945, the Yamato sailed on her final mission, a one-way suicide run to Okinawa, where she would beach herself and fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. She carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. She had no air cover. She had no support. She had only her 18-inch guns and the determination of 2,700 men who knew they were going to die. American aircraft found her on April 7th, 200 miles south of her target. Over 400 planes attacked in waves. The Yamato fought magnificently, her anti-aircraft batteries creating walls of fire, her main guns loaded with special anti-aircraft shells that exploded in massive air bursts. She shot down dozens of aircraft. It was not enough. Torpedoes struck her port side, creating a list that could not be corrected. More torpedoes hit. More bombs fell. At 14:23 hours, her forward magazine exploded, a detonation so massive that the mushroom cloud was visible 100 miles away. She rolled over and sank, taking 2,055 men with her. I learned of the Yamato's death 3 days later. I felt nothing. The capacity for grief had been exhausted at Leyte Gulf. The Yamato's sinking was simply confirmation of what I already knew. We had lost. Not just the battle, not just the war, but everything the Navy represented. The carriers were gone, the battleships were gone, the cruisers were gone, the destroyers were gone, the aircraft were gone, the pilots were gone, the sailors were gone. On August 15th, 1945, the Emperor spoke on the radio for the first time in history, his voice strange and formal, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. We had lost. Everything we had sacrificed, everyone who had died, all the ships at the bottom of the Pacific, all of it was for nothing. I remained in the Navy during the occupation, helping American forces document what remained of our fleet. I guided American officers through sunken ship databases, explaining which vessels lay in which harbors, which could be salvaged, and which were too destroyed.
They were professional and courteous, victors without arrogance, which somehow made it worse. One afternoon in September 1945, an American naval officer named Lieutenant Commander Daniel, an intelligence specialist, asked me about Leyte Gulf. He had been studying Japanese tactical decisions, trying to understand why Admiral Kurita had withdrawn when he was so close to the American transports. I tried to explain about the air attacks, the formation dissolution, the tactical situation. He listened patiently, then asked the question that I could not answer. Why did you think you could win? I had no answer. Because we had been told we would? Because we believed in spiritual superiority? Because we could not imagine losing? All true, all meaningless. We thought we could win because the alternative was unthinkable, and so we did not think about it. We thought we could win because we had always won, until suddenly we started losing and could not stop. The Americans documented everything with their characteristic thoroughness. They surveyed every sunken ship, interviewed every surviving officer, compiled reports that ran to thousands of pages. They wanted to understand how they had won so completely. I could have told them, but they would not believe me. They won because they had more. More ships, more planes, more fuel, more ammunition, more industrial capacity, more redundancy, more backup systems, more training, more technology, more of everything that mattered in modern warfare. Spirit was irrelevant when one side could replace losses faster than the other could inflict them.
I left the Navy in 1947, returning to civilian life in a Japan that no longer existed. The cities were ruins. The economy was shattered. The culture that had glorified military service and samurai codes was being rebuilt around pacifism and democracy. Everything we had believed in was being systematically dismantled and replaced with American ideas about government and society and human value. I became a teacher in Yokohama, teaching mathematics and navigation to students who would never need to navigate warships, who would grow up in a Japan where military service was prohibited by constitution. They asked me sometimes about the war, about what it was like, about why we lost. I told them about mathematics and trigonometry and the principles of celestial navigation. I did not tell them about watching the Otago sink, about floating in burning oil, about the destroyer charging the Yamato, about the Musashi absorbing torpedo after torpedo until she died. Those memories belonged to a different world, a world of steel and fire and death that had no place in the peaceful Japan being built on the ruins. I returned to Leyte Gulf once in 1972 as part of a reconciliation ceremony organized by veterans groups from both nations. We sailed over the battlefield in a modern ship with sonar that could map the bottom, showing the wrecks scattered across the seabed. The Musashi lay in 3,000 feet of water, upright, her main turrets still pointing skyward as if ready to fire. The Fuso, the Yamashiro, the carriers, the cruisers, the destroyers, all resting in the darkness, tombs for thousands of men who had believed they were fighting for something larger than themselves. American veterans were there, old men now like me, gray-haired and slow-moving, wearing caps with their ship names embroidered. We spoke haltingly through translators at first, then finding we could communicate through the shared experience of having survived when so many did not. A man named Mitchell, who had been a gunner on the destroyer Johnston, showed me a photograph of his ship,
I told him that I had watched her die, that I had seen her captain saluting as she went down. Mitchell cried, tears running down wrinkled cheeks, and told me his captain was the finest man he had ever known. We stood at the rail together, Japanese and American, looking at water that revealed nothing of what lay beneath. The sea was calm, the same blue I remembered from October 1944, before the fire and smoke and death transformed it into something else. Mitchell asked me if I hated them, the Americans, for what they had done. I told him no. How could I hate them for being better prepared, better equipped, better trained? How could I hate them for winning a war we started? The hate had died somewhere in the oil slicks off Samar, drowned along with everything else we had believed. Another American, a pilot named Sorensen, who had flown from the escort carrier Kitkun Bay, described attacking our ships that morning. He talked about how terrified he had been, how he had expected to die, how he had attacked a cruiser with only his machine guns because his ordnance had already been dropped on ground targets. He described seeing our anti-aircraft fire, walls of it, thinking it was impossible to fly through and survive. Yet he had survived, and we had not, and neither of us could fully explain why. The Japanese veterans at the ceremony were few. Most of the men I had served with were dead, drowned or killed in subsequent actions, or lost in the chaos of Japan's collapse. Of the 4,000 men who had sailed aboard the Otago, perhaps 200 survived the war. The Yahagi herself had been sunk off Okinawa in April 1945, accompanying the Yamato on her final mission. Over 400 men went down with her. I would have been among them if I had not been transferred to shore duty. Survival was random, arbitrary, meaningless. The best officers and the worst both died with equal probability. Skill and courage offered no protection against high explosive and aviation fuel.
We dropped wreaths into the water during the ceremony, flowers floating on the surface above the ships below. A Shinto priest performed a blessing for the dead, his voice carrying across the water in words that meant nothing to the Americans, but everything to those of us who had lost brothers and friends in these depths. An American chaplain spoke about sacrifice and honor and the waste of war. He spoke well, with genuine feeling, but the words felt empty against the reality of what had happened here. 12,500 Japanese sailors died in these waters over 4 days. The words to adequately memorialize that loss did not exist in any language. That night, in the ship's lounge, the American veterans shared their stories. They talked about their fear, their confusion, their terror at seeing our battleships appear on the horizon. They described the desperation of those hours of Samar, certain they were going to die, throwing everything they had at us to buy minutes for the carriers to escape. One man, a destroyer officer named Walsh, described watching the Johnston charge the Yamato and thinking it was the bravest and most foolish thing he had ever witnessed. I told them about watching that charge from our side, about how it had broken our formation, bought precious time, created chaos in our attack. I told them about the officer saluting as his ship died. Walsh was quiet for a long time, then said that Commander Evans had received the Medal of Honor posthumously, America's highest decoration for valor.
He said the Navy taught every officer about Evans, about the Johnston, about the Battle of Samar, where destroyers charged battleships. He said it was considered one of the finest moments in American naval history. I had not known. For 28 years I had carried the memory of that destroyer dying, had thought of it as a tragedy, a waste, a futile gesture in a battle already lost. But the Americans saw it as victory, as proof that courage and determination could overcome material disadvantage, as validation of everything they believed about their navy and their nation. The same action, viewed from opposite sides, carried completely different meanings. Sorensen asked me about the Musashi, about what it was like to watch the mightiest battleship ever built absorb attack after attack and continue fighting. I tried to explain what it felt like to see something supposedly invincible gradually succumb to massed aerial attacks, to watch the logic of our entire naval strategy proven obsolete in real time. The Musashi represented everything Japan had bet on: massive armor, huge guns, technological superiority in surface warfare. The Americans destroyed her with converted torpedo bombers and dive bombers flown by pilots who had been civilians a year earlier. The symbolism was perfect and crushing. We drank together that night, sake and American whiskey mixing in our glasses as the stories flowed. The alcohol loosened tongues and memories, and gradually we moved past the sanitized official histories into the raw truth of what combat had been like. Mitchell described watching his crewmates die on the Johnston, torn apart by shells from our cruisers, screaming as their ship disintegrated around them. Walsh talked about the smell of burning oil and flesh after an attack, how it coated your throat and never quite left. Sorensen admitted that he had nightmares for years after the war, dreaming of ships exploding beneath him, of men drowning in fire. I told them about the Otago sinking, about the sound of men trapped in flooded compartments, hammering on watertight doors that could not be opened, their voices cutting off one by one as the water rose. I told them about floating in the fuel oil, thick and choking, coating everything, and watching other survivors simply give up, sliding beneath the surface because continuing was too difficult. I told them about the men on the Musashi, over 1,000 of them, most of whom never made it off the ship, trapped in magazines and engine rooms and damage control stations, when she rolled over.
The Americans were quiet. They had won, but they understood the cost. They had lost friends too, seen ships sink, watched men die. The victory had not been clean or easy or glorious. It had been bloody and terrifying and traumatic for everyone involved. The only difference was that they had returned home to parades and celebrations, while we had returned to ashes and occupation. Mitchell asked the question that haunted all of us. Did it mean anything? All the dying, all the sacrifice, all the courage on both sides. Did it accomplish anything beyond creating widows and orphans and traumatized survivors? I had spent 28 years trying to answer that question and still had no satisfactory response. From Japan's perspective, the battle meant the end of our navy, the loss of the Philippines, the inevitability of defeat.
From America's perspective, it meant securing the liberation of the Philippines, destroying Japanese naval power, and shortening the war. Same battle, completely different meanings, neither of which offered much comfort to the men who had floated in the water, watching their ships burn. The ceremony ended the next day. We returned to our respective countries, old men carrying old memories, trying to find meaning in events that had shaped our lives but remained fundamentally senseless. War created heroes and victims, victories and defeats, but rarely created understanding. We had been enemies, then adversaries, now something like friends, bonded by shared trauma and the knowledge that we had survived when so many others had not. I often think about what I would tell my younger self, the 24-year-old fire control officer standing on the Otago's deck on October 23, 1944, watching the sun rise over the Philippine Sea, confident in his navy and his cause and his inevitable victory. What would I say to that young man who had no idea what was coming, who believed in samurai spirit and technological superiority and the righteousness of his nation's war? I would tell him that everything he believes is wrong, that spirit cannot stop torpedoes, that training and tradition cannot compensate for radar and industrial capacity, that the enemy he has been taught to despise as soft and materialistic will prove harder and braver than anyone imagined, that the ships he thinks are invincible will burn like paper, and that the navy he serves will cease to exist in 6 months, and that he will survive when better men die, and that survival will be its own kind of torment. But would it matter? Would that young officer believe me? Or would he do exactly what he did, what he had to do, because the culture he lived in offered no alternative to obedience and duty and sacrifice? We were products of our time and place, shaped by forces larger than individual choice. The Americans were products of their culture too, shaped by different values that nonetheless led to the same destination. Young men in uniform, far from home, doing what they were told, dying for causes they barely understood. The last time I saw the ocean was in 1995, 51 years after Leyte Gulf. I was 75 years old, my health failing, my body worn out by age and memory. I traveled to Yokosuka and stood on the shore, looking out at water that extended to the horizon, hiding beneath its surface all the steel and bone and regret of a war that had killed millions and accomplished nothing but devastation. The Japanese Navy had been rebuilt after the war, renamed the Maritime Self-Defense Force, prohibited by Constitution from projecting power beyond national defense. The ships were modern, equipped with missiles and helicopters and electronics that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944, but they flew the rising sun flag again, modified to satisfy American requirements but still recognizably Japanese. The cycle continued. Nations building navies, preparing for wars, training young men to fight and die for abstractions like honor and duty and national interest. I wondered what would happen if those young sailors, Japanese and American and Chinese and Russian, all the modern navies preparing for hypothetical conflicts, could see what I had seen. Would they still volunteer? Would they still salute their flags and learn their weapon systems and practice their combat drills? Or would they refuse, understanding that the glory they imagine is really horror, that the honor they seek is really trauma, and that the victory they anticipate
is really loss for everyone involved.
But they would not refuse. They would do what we did, what young men have always done, what they will continue to do until humanity evolves beyond nationalism and militarism and the belief that violence solves problems. They would follow orders, trust their leaders, believe the propaganda, and sail toward their own Leyte Gulfs, learning too late that war is not what they were promised. The mathematics of Leyte Gulf are clear. The Japanese Navy committed 64 major warships. The Americans committed approximately 200. The Japanese lost 28 ships. The Americans lost 6. The Japanese lost 12,500 men. The Americans lost 3,000. Simple mathematics. Overwhelming force defeating inadequate resistance. But mathematics cannot calculate trauma, cannot measure the psychological cost of watching your ship sink, cannot quantify the weight of survivor's guilt that crushes you for decades afterward. I carried that weight for 51 years. I carried the memory of the Otago sinking, of men drowning in fuel oil, of the Musashi absorbing torpedo after torpedo, of destroyers charging battleships, of the Yamato's final mission, of all the waste and horror and pointless sacrifice. I carried the knowledge that we had been lied to, that our leaders had sent us to die for a strategy that was obsolete before it began, that the samurai spirit they glorified was inadequate against industrial warfare. But I also carried gratitude. Gratitude that I survived when so many others did not. Gratitude that Japan rebuilt itself into a peaceful, prosperous nation that rejected militarism. Gratitude that I lived long enough to meet former enemies and discover they were not demons, but men, scared and brave and traumatized like us. Gratitude that younger generations would not have to experience what we experienced, would not have to float in burning oil watching their world sink beneath them. In my final years, students would sometimes ask me about Leyte Gulf, about what really happened, about what it meant. I told them the facts, the dates and ships and casualties. I told them about the strategic situation, the tactical decisions, the technological disparities. I told them everything except the truth, because the truth was too painful and too personal and too difficult to communicate to people who had never watched a ship die. The truth was that Leyte Gulf killed the Imperial Japanese Navy, not just physically, but spiritually. It demonstrated beyond any doubt that our naval strategy, our battleship-centric doctrine, our faith in decisive surface actions was obsolete. It showed that aircraft carriers and massed air power had fundamentally changed naval warfare in ways our leadership refused to accept until forced to by bitter experience. It proved that industrial capacity and technological advantage mattered more than courage and tradition and fighting spirit. But more than that, Leyte Gulf killed something in those of us who survived it. It killed the innocent belief that we were fighting for something noble and righteous. It killed the faith in our leaders who had assured us of victory. It killed the certainty that our sacrifices meant something. We had given everything, and it was not enough. We had fought with honor and courage and skill, and we had lost decisively. The universe did not care about our values or our traditions or our noble intentions. It cared about tonnage and fuel capacity and industrial production and radar technology. That was the lesson of Leyte Gulf. The lesson I spent 50 years trying to unlearn, because accepting it meant accepting that my navy, my service, my beliefs had all been based on illusions. But illusions or not, we had believed, we had fought, we had died, And perhaps the believing mattered more than whether what we believed was true. Perhaps the courage mattered more than whether it accomplished anything. Perhaps the sacrifice mattered even if the cause was lost. I died in 1996, 76 years old, surrounded by family who knew I had served in the Navy but knew nothing of what that service had cost me. I was buried with honor, a veteran of the Maritime Self-Defense Force, a teacher who had educated hundreds of students, a man who had lived a full life. The obituary mentioned my service at Leyte Gulf in one line: naval officer during the Pacific War, participated in major actions including Leyte Gulf.
Those words contained multitudes. They contained the Otago sinking beneath me, the Musashi dying slowly over 8 hours, the destroyer charging the Yamato, the oil-slicked survivors floating in the tropical sea, the American aircraft swarming like locusts, the failure and death and waste of it all. They contained everything and nothing, words that marked participation without explaining experience, that documented presence without communicating understanding. The sea keeps its secrets. The wrecks lie undisturbed in the darkness, slowly corroding, gradually returning to their component elements. The bones of the men who died with their ships have long since dissolved, scattered by currents, consumed by marine life, recycled by the ocean into new forms. Nothing remains but steel and memory. And eventually, even the steel will be gone, dissolved by seawater and time, leaving only memory. And then, not even that, when the last of us who remember are gone. But perhaps the forgetting is necessary. Perhaps the next generation needs to believe that war can be noble, that sacrifice can be meaningful, that courage matters, that their cause is just. Perhaps they need those illusions to function, to build their societies, to defend their nations. Perhaps the truth I learned in the waters of Samar would paralyze them, would make them unable to act when action is necessary, would rob them of the beliefs that allow human civilization to continue despite all evidence that we are terrible at it. Or perhaps I am wrong. Perhaps they need to know the truth, need to understand what war really costs, need to see through the propaganda and nationalism and glorification to the underlying reality of terror and waste and trauma. Perhaps if enough people really understood what Leyte Gulf was like, they would refuse to repeat it. They would find other ways to resolve conflicts, other methods of national defense, other approaches to international relations that did not involve sending young men to die in burning ships. But I doubt it. Humans have fought wars for thousands of years, despite endless evidence of their horror and futility. Each generation thinks their war is different, their cause more just, their sacrifice more meaningful. Each generation learns the same bitter lessons their ancestors learned, then forgets them long enough to send the next generation to learn them again. The cycle continues, the pattern repeats, and old men like me stand at the water's edge, watching the sea, remembering what lies beneath, wondering if any of it mattered. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But it was also the end of an era, the final gasp of a form of warfare that had dominated for centuries. After Leyte Gulf, no major surface action between battleship fleets would ever occur again. The future belonged to carriers and aircraft, to guided missiles and nuclear submarines, to technologies that made our massive guns and heavy armor obsolete.
We were dinosaurs, fighting with steam and steel in an age that had moved beyond us. Standing on the Yatago's deck on October 23, 1944, I had believed we were sailing toward victory. I had believed in our ships, our training, our spirit. I had believed that courage and determination could overcome material disadvantage. I had believed all the things young men believe when they have never experienced catastrophic defeat, never watched invincible ships sink, never floated in burning oil wondering why they survived when better men drowned. 4 days later, I knew better. 4 days to destroy a navy, to shatter an illusion, to learn that the universe does not care about courage, honor, or righteousness. 4 days to transform the Japanese Navy from a proud fighting force into a collection of sinking ships and drowning men and desperate survivors. 4 days that would haunt me for 51 years, that would shape everything I thought and did and believed for the rest of my life.
The sea of fire off Samar consumed more than ships and men. It consumed the last vestiges of Japan's naval power, the final hope of avoiding defeat, the illusion that fighting spirit could compensate for industrial inferiority. It consumed the beliefs that had sustained us, the traditions that had guided us, the certainty that our cause was just and our victory inevitable. It left nothing but smoke and oil and bodies floating in the tropical water, slowly sinking into darkness, joining the thousands who had gone before and the thousands who would follow. I was one of the lucky ones. I survived. I came home. I rebuilt my life. But part of me remained in those waters, floating in the oil slicks, watching the Yatago's propellers turn in the air, seeing the Musashi settle slowly beneath the waves, witnessing the destroyer charge the Yamato, experiencing the moment when certainty gave way to doubt and belief gave way to knowledge. That part of me never left the Philippine Sea, never stopped drowning, never found peace. This is my testimony. This is what Leyte Gulf was like for one man, one survivor among thousands, one voice among the multitudes who experienced that battle and carried its weight for the rest of their lives. It is not the official history. It is not the strategic analysis. It is not the tactical assessment. It is simply the truth as I lived it, the memory as I carried it, the burden as I bore it. May those ships rest in peace. May those men be remembered. May their sacrifice, meaningless as it seems, somehow contribute to a world that learns to resolve its conflicts without sending young men to die in burning seas. May we someday evolve beyond the nationalism and militarism that made Leyte Gulf necessary. May the sea of fire that consumed the Imperial Japanese Navy be the last such conflagration humanity creates. But I doubt it. The cycle continues. New ships sail toward new battles, carrying new young men who believe in new causes, certain of new victories, unknowing of the fire that awaits them. The sea keeps its secrets, but the pattern remains unchanged. We remember, we mourn, we promise never again, and then we repeat it all with different flags and different justifications and the same terrible outcomes. I stood on the Yatago's deck in October 1944, confident and proud, sailing toward what I thought was victory. 4 days later, I was floating in burning oil, watching my navy die, learning that everything I believed was wrong. That is the lesson of Leyte Gulf. The truth beneath the tactics and strategy and statistics. We sailed toward glory and found only fire. We sought victory and found only death. We believed in our cause and learned that belief is not enough. The sea remembers what we forget. The wrecks remain when the memories fade. And somewhere in the darkness off Samar, the Otago rests, her propellers still, her guns silent, her crew entombed in steel, waiting for a future that will never come, fighting a war that was already lost before the first torpedo struck. That is where part of me remains, will always remain, floating in the oil slicks, watching the ships sink, understanding too late what it all meant. The sea of fire consumed everything, the ships, the men, the navy, the dream. Only the memory remains, and that too will eventually fade, leaving nothing but empty ocean, revealing nothing of what lies beneath, keeping its secrets, waiting for the next generation to sail toward its own Leyte Gulf, to learn its own bitter lessons, to discover that the sea always wins, that steel always sinks, that courage is not enough, that nothing is ever enough against the mathematics of modern warfare. This was Leyte Gulf. This was the end. This was the fire that consumed us all.